At his funeral, strangers claimed to be his real family. The will left it all to me, but no amount of money could erase the betrayal. One moment I was mourning the love of my twilight years. The next, I discovered I was the mistress, not the partner, a footnote in someone else's marriage. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The mahogany casket gleamed under the weak January sun, polished to a mirror shine that seemed obscenely cheerful against the backdrop of my grief. I adjusted the black scarf around my neck, my fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the simple gold pendant Richard had given me on our 3rd anniversary. "He looked peaceful at the end," whispered Margaret, my oldest friend, squeezing my gloved hand. "Heart attacks can be merciful that way." I nodded, not trusting my voice. At 71, I was no stranger to funerals, but burying Richard felt different. After losing my husband of 40 years to cancer, I never expected to find love again. Then Richard Montgomery walked into my community center literature class with his dog-eared copy of Hemingway and Shy Smile, and everything changed. 5 years, 5 beautiful, unexpected years we'd shared. Not enough time, but I was grateful for every moment. The minister's words washed over me as I stared at the casket. Only 20 people had come. A few of my friends, Richard's lawyer Harold, and some former colleagues. Richard had always been private about our relationship. "Business complications," he'd explained. I never pushed. "Eleanor." Harold's urgent whisper pulled me from my thoughts. "Do you know those people?" I followed his gaze toward the cemetery entrance where a small group had appeared. An elegant, silver-haired woman, 2 middle-aged men in expensive suits, and a teenage girl. They stood at a distance, watching our small gathering with unreadable expressions. "No," I murmured, a strange unease creeping up my spine. "Should I?" Harold's face tightened. "Let me handle this." But it was too late. As the service concluded and people offered their condolences, the silver-haired woman approached, her posture regal, her eyes locked on mine. The men flanked her protectively while the girl hung back, studying me with intense curiosity. "I'm Vivian Montgomery," she announced, her cultured voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. "Richard's wife of 45 years. The world tilted beneath my feet. My mind struggled to process her words while my body went numb. "I find it curious I wasn't notified of my husband's passing," she continued, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Fortunately, my son Gregory has contacts at the funeral home." "Mother," the older man murmured, glancing uncomfortably at the small crowd, now watching this unfolding drama. Harold stepped between us. "Mrs. Montgomery, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "What is there to discuss?" Her voice was silk over steel. "This woman has been playing house with my husband. I'm simply here to bury him." "Richard and I were together for 5 years," I said, finding my voice at last. "He told me he was divorced." Vivian's laugh was like breaking glass. "Divorced? Oh, my dear, no. Richard and I had an understanding. He needed his diversions." Her gaze swept over me dismissively, though he usually preferred them younger. The funeral director approached, his face ashen. "Mrs. Montgomery, we had no idea. The arrangements were made by his mistress." "Yes, I see that now." Vivian's perfect composure never cracked. Richard always did have a flair for the dramatic. Even in death, I stood there, humiliation burning through my shock. The sympathetic glances from my friends had transformed into something else. Pity, curiosity, perhaps even judgment. 40 years as a respected literature professor, a widow who'd conducted herself with dignity, and now, this. "The will reading is scheduled for Friday," Harold said quietly, taking my elbow. "Perhaps we should all reconvene then." As he guided me toward the car, I caught the teenage girl's gaze. Unlike the others, there was no malice in her eyes, only a complicated sadness that mirrored the storm building inside me. "Eleanor," Harold murmured, "there's much more to this situation than appears. Richard left instructions, preparations. Don't make any decisions until we've spoken privately." I nodded mechanically, but inside, something had shattered beyond repair. The man I mourned, had he ever truly existed? 3 days later, I sat rigidly in Harold Baker's office, the weight of unfamiliar eyes boring into me. Across the polished conference table, the Montgomery family formed a united front. Vivian in elegant mourning attire, her sons Gregory and Robert in bespoke suits that screamed old money, and young Megan, who kept her eyes downcast. My simple black dress felt suddenly inadequate. like everything else about me, in this opulent downtown high-rise where Richard had apparently built his real estate empire, an empire I knew almost nothing about. "Before we begin," Harold said, adjusting his reading glasses, "I want to confirm that Richard updated this will 2 months ago with full medical certification of his mental competence." He shot a pointed look at Gregory, who had been whispering to his brother. "The document is legally binding and witnessed according to state law." "Get on with it," Gregory snapped. "We all know why we're here." Harold cleared his throat. "Very well. To my wife, Vivian Montgomery, I leave her existing annual stipend of $350,000 as established in our amended prenuptial agreement and lifetime residence rights to our primary home in Beacon Hill." Vivian's expression remained impassive, but her knuckles whitened around her designer handbag. "To my sons, Gregory and Robert Montgomery, I leave 20% of my personal fortune to be divided equally between them, along with my summer house in Nantucket and winter residence in Aspen." The brothers exchanged glances, their faces darkening. "To my granddaughter, Megan Montgomery, I establish a trust of $5 million for her education and future endeavors, accessible in full upon her 25th birthday." The girl looked up for the first time, surprise flickering across her face. "The remaining 70% of my estate, valued at approximately $27 million, along with controlling interest in Montgomery Development Corporation and my 3 remaining properties, I leave to Eleanor Wright, who brought joy and meaning to my final years." The room erupted. Gregory slammed his hand on the table while Robert unleashed a stream of obscenities. Vivian remained perfectly still, only the slight tremor in her jaw betraying her fury. "This is absurd," Gregory hissed, standing abruptly. "My father was not in his right mind." "The medical certification," Harold began. "Can be challenged," Robert interrupted. "This woman clearly manipulated him." "That woman has a name," I said quietly, finding my voice. "And I never asked Richard for anything. Except, apparently, his entire legacy," Vivian replied, her voice deadly calm. "Quite an achievement for a literature teacher, was it?" "Professor," I corrected, meeting her gaze steadily. "And I had no idea about any of this." "Of course not," Gregory sneered. "Just like you had no idea he was married." The barb hit its mark, but I refused to flinch. I believed what Richard told me. "A common weakness among mistresses," Vivian said with false sympathy, believing what they wished to hear. Harold interrupted by sliding a sealed envelope across the table to me. "Richard asked me to give you this privately. It contains explanations." I tucked the envelope into my purse, suddenly desperate to escape this room and these people who looked at me with such contempt. "This isn't over," Robert warned as I stood to leave. "Not by a long shot." "No," I agreed, surprising myself with my steady voice. "I don't believe it is." Outside the building, I blinked in the harsh winter sunlight, still struggling to reconcile the Richard I knew, thoughtful, sometimes melancholy, with simple tastes, despite his obvious comfort, with the titan of industry whose fortune was now causing such turmoil. A camera flash startled me. Across the street, a man with a telephoto lens quickly ducked into a parked car. "They'll be coming for you now," Harold murmured, appearing at my side. "The press, the social climbers, the opportunists." Richard feared this. That's why he made arrangements. "What arrangements?" I asked. "Read the letter," he replied. "Then we'll talk about how to weather the storm that's coming." A week passed before I found the courage to open Richard's letter. I sat at my modest writing desk in the apartment where we'd spent countless evenings discussing books and sharing quiet dinners. He'd offered many times to move me into his penthouse, a residence I now knew he shared with Vivian when not with me. My hands trembled as I broke the seal on the heavy cream envelope. 3 pages of familiar handwriting spilled out, along with a small key. "My dearest Eleanor, by now you know the truth I was too cowardly to share. I've lived a fractured life, divided between obligation and desire, between the family I was bound to and the woman who truly saw me. Vivian and I haven't functioned as true partners for over 30 years. Our marriage became a business arrangement decades ago, maintained for social appearances and complex financial entanglements that I lacked the courage to sever. I tried to divorce her 3 times. Each attempt was met with threats to expose irregularities in the early years of my business that would have destroyed not just me, but hundreds of employees who depended on the company. I chose protection over honesty, a choice I've paid for with my integrity. When I met you, I was already living separate lives between Boston and Chicago. The division existed long before you. You weren't the other woman. You were the only authentic relationship I had. I paused, wiping unexpected tears. Even in death, Richard was trying to absolve me of guilt I hadn't yet fully processed. There's something more you should know. I have reason to believe neither Gregory nor Robert are my biological sons. Vivian admitted to affairs during our early marriage. I raised them as my own regardless, providing them every advantage. But their character flaws, the entitlement, the coldness, I've always wondered if these traits reflected their true parentage. 10 years ago, I established substantial trusts for both sons, accessible when they turn 50. They know nothing of these funds. Their financial recklessness concerned me too much to tell them. I've instructed Harold to protect you. The family will contest the will, claiming I was mentally incompetent or unduly influenced. The enclosed key opens a safety deposit box at First Commonwealth Bank containing documentation that proves otherwise. Medical examinations, correspondence, video recordings of our discussions about my estate planning. Please forgive me, Eleanor. I found real love with you, but my cowardice prevented me from giving you the honest life you deserved. In death, I hope to provide what I couldn't in life: security, recognition, and the truth. With all my love, Richard. I set the letter down, emotions warring within me. Anger at his deception competed with lingering love and newfound pity for a man trapped in a cage, partly of his own making. My phone chimed with an incoming email. The subject line sent ice through my veins. Notice of will contest, Montgomery Estate. An unfamiliar law firm informed me that the Montgomery family was contesting Richard's will, citing mental incapacity and undue influence by Eleanor Wright, caretaker. They'd already scheduled depositions for my friends, former colleagues, even students I'd taught years ago. Caretaker? The word stung worse than mistress. They weren't just challenging the will, they were rewriting our entire relationship. I reached for my phone to call Harold, then hesitated. First, I needed to see what was in that safety deposit box. Whatever battle lay ahead, I needed to understand exactly what Richard had left me to fight with. The key felt impossibly heavy in my palm. A final gift from a man I thought I knew, but perhaps never truly did. Have you seen this? Margaret thrust a magazine toward me across our usual cafe table. We were supposed to be having our monthly lunch, but her worried expression told me this wasn't a social visit. I glanced down at the local society publication. On page 6, a small but devastating headline. Montgomery widow contests will, claims late husband manipulated by caretaker. The brief article quoted an unnamed source close to the family, claiming Richard had been in cognitive decline, easily influenced by the retired teacher who insinuated herself into his life. The photograph showed me leaving Harold's office, looking shell-shocked and small. "It's starting," I murmured, pushing the magazine away. "Starting? Eleanor, it's been happening for weeks. Haven't you noticed people acting strangely?" I had. The barista who always chatted with me now avoided eye contact. My neighbor's usual warm greeting had cooled to a curt nod. I'd attributed it to my own distracted state. But now, Cynthia canceled our book club, Margaret continued, said she didn't think it was appropriate right now. And Jean asked if it was true you were Richard's nurse. His nurse? The absurdity might have made me laugh if the pain weren't so sharp. We met in my literature seminar. He was a student, for God's sake. They're painting you as an opportunist, Ellie. A gold digger who targeted a vulnerable widower. Richard wasn't a widower, I said bitterly. He was very much married. Margaret reached across the table. You didn't know that. It doesn't matter what I knew. It only matters what people believe. My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. The Montgomery name carries weight in this city. My phone rang. The private school where I'd taught for 40 years before retirement. The director's voice was carefully neutral. Eleanor, I'm calling about the alumni reception next month. Given the current situation, we think it might be best if you didn't attend this year. My grip tightened on the phone. The current situation? The publicity. We've received calls from concerned board members and parents. Nothing personal, you understand. But the school's reputation? Nothing personal. Just my character being assassinated, my life's work being erased by whispers and innuendo. I understand perfectly, I said, ending the call. Margaret watched me with concern. What are you going to do? What could I do? Fight the collective power of a wealthy family with decades of social connections? Challenge the narrative already taking root that I was a predatory gold digger? That afternoon, I met with Harold in a private room at his club rather than his office. "They're moving faster than I expected," he admitted, reviewing the growing collection of tabloid mentions and social media comments. "Vivian has always been ruthlessly efficient. They're making me into a villain," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "Everything I've worked for, my reputation," "Which is precisely what they want," Harold interrupted. "If they can damage your standing enough, any judge will be sympathetic to their claim that you manipulated Richard. Should I consider a settlement?" The words tasted like ash. Harold studied me. "Is that what you want? To take a fraction of what Richard intended for you and disappear?" "I don't care about the money. I never did. I know that. But Richard did. He spent his final years ensuring you would be protected." Harold's expression softened. He knew exactly what Vivian would do. "That's why he prepared." I thought of the safety deposit box contents I'd examined, meticulous records of Richard's mental evaluations, financial statements, personal journals dating back decades. "If I fight, they'll destroy what's left of my reputation. If I surrender, you validate their portrayal of you," Harold finished. "And everything Richard tried to do for you will have been in vain." As I left the club, a sealed envelope waited on my windshield. Inside, a typed note. "We know what you are. The money isn't yours. Back off while you still can." I stared at the threat, something hardening inside me. I'd spent my life teaching literature, stories of people facing impossible choices, moral dilemmas, moments of reckoning. Now I was living one. That night, I made my decision. Not out of greed or pride, but something deeper. A responsibility to the truth, however complicated and painful it might be. The cabin in Maine appeared exactly as I remembered from our weekend retreats. A simple cedar structure nestled among towering pines, overlooking a small private lake. Richard had purchased it quietly 3 years ago, putting the deed solely in my name as a gift. "Something that's just ours," he'd said. Now I understood it had been more than a romantic gesture. It was an escape route. The gravel crunched under my tires as I parked, checking once more that I hadn't been followed. I'd told no one of my departure, not even Harold. My apartment was locked up, mail forwarded to a post office box, and I'd withdrawn enough cash to last several months. The Montgomery family could continue their character assassination campaign in my absence. Inside, everything remained untouched since our last visit 6 months ago. I ran my fingers over the Riverstone fireplace, remembering Richard stoking flames on chilly evenings while we discussed books or simply sat in comfortable silence. "There's a safe behind the painting in the bedroom," he'd mentioned once, almost casually. "The combination is the day we met, just in case you ever need anything when I'm not here." I'd thought nothing of it then. Now, I moved to the bedroom and carefully removed the landscape painting, revealing a sophisticated wall safe. My fingers trembled slightly as I entered the date, January 12th, 2019, and heard the satisfying click of the lock disengaging. Inside, I found neatly organized folders, external hard drives, and a leather-bound journal. The first folder contained photographs, Richard and Vivian at various social functions over decades, their smiles growing progressively more fixed with time. Then came financial records, meticulously annotated by Richard's hand, tracking unusual transactions and discrepancies dating back 15 years. The journal entries began in 2010, documenting in Richard's precise handwriting his growing suspicions about financial irregularities in the company divisions managed by his sons. He'd hired forensic accountants disguised as regular auditors. They found evidence of funds being diverted to offshore accounts, clients being overbilled, and regulatory corners being cut. Most disturbing were the transcripts of recorded conversations between Vivian and Gregory, discussing how to conceal these activities from Richard. "He's getting too interested in the Westlake project numbers," Gregory had said. "We need to distract him." "Leave your father to me," Vivian had replied. "I've managed him for 40 years. My stomach turned as I realized the extent of the manipulation. Richard hadn't just been unloved in his marriage. He'd been actively undermined by his own family, kept occupied with busy work projects while they siphoned millions from his company. A separate folder labeled Contingency contained enough evidence to not only win any will contest, but potentially trigger criminal investigations. Bank statements, offshore account numbers, copies of falsified reports presented to Richard and the board of directors. As days turned into weeks, I methodically reviewed everything, creating a chronology of deception spanning decades. The Richard portrayed in these documents was not the confident businessman the world saw, but a man increasingly isolated within his own family, seeking escape in Chicago, where he'd established a separate life with me. In one journal entry from 2021, he wrote, "Eleanor represents everything authentic I've lost: intellectual curiosity, genuine connection, the simple joy of being truly seen. With her, I'm not the Montgomery fortune or the company founder. I'm just Richard, a man with opinions about Hemingway and a weakness for jazz." Tears blurred my vision as I read his private thoughts, understanding at last the weight he'd carried. His deception toward me, never revealing his marriage, seemed almost a desperate attempt to preserve the one uncomplicated relationship in his life. A knock at the door startled me from my research. My heart pounded as I peered through the window, expecting Vivian's hired investigators. Instead, Harold Baker stood on the porch, looking relieved when I opened the door. "Thank God," he said. "Richard made me promise to check on you if you disappeared. Are you all right?" I gestured to the documents spread across the dining table. "I'm learning who my partner really was. They've escalated beyond what even I expected," Harold said, spreading newspaper clippings across the cabin's dining table. 3 months had passed since Richard's funeral, and the Montgomery family's campaign against me had intensified. I scanned the headlines. Montgomery heir claims father was mentally compromised, and family friends question relationship between tycoon and former teacher. "They've hired Blackridge Partners," Harold continued, referring to a notorious crisis management firm. "They're building a narrative that Richard was experiencing early dementia, making him susceptible to influence. That's absurd. Richard was sharp until the end. They've produced 3 former employees willing to testify otherwise. People can be persuaded to remember things differently when enough money is involved." I pinched the bridge of my nose, fighting a headache. "And my reputation?" Harold's expression softened. "They've been thorough. Former students interviewed about whether you showed predatory tendencies. Colleagues questioned about your financial situation before meeting Richard. And let me guess, they've implied I was desperate, more or less. Your modest lifestyle is being framed as motivation for targeting a wealthy widower." "He wasn't a widower," I said automatically, the familiar pain resurfacing. Harold nodded, then gestured to the documents we'd organized. "You found enough here to counter their claims about Richard's mental state. The question is, how do we use it?" I rose and moved to the window, watching pine branches sway in the spring breeze. "I've been thinking about that. What did Richard want? For you to have financial security and recognition of your place in his life?" "Yes, but more than that." I turned back to Harold. "These journals show a man who protected his company and employees above all else. He could have exposed Gregory and Robert years ago, but he feared the collateral damage." Harold studied me. "What are you suggesting?" "A different approach. Not a scorched earth counterattack, but something more strategic." Over the next hours, we outlined a plan. Instead of publicly exposing the family's financial misdeeds immediately, we would initiate a series of precisely targeted actions, requesting specific corporate records that would force internal reviews, engaging a respected forensic accounting firm under the guise of valuing my inherited shares, filing motions that would require Gregory and Robert to testify under oath about specific transactions. "We create pressure points," I explained, while presenting an image of dignified restraint. "Let them be the aggressors while we appear reasonable." Harold looked impressed. "Literature professor indeed. You understand narrative better than their PR firm." "I've taught Shakespeare's tragedies for 4 decades, I said with a thin smile. "I know something about how pride leads to downfall." As evening approached, Harold prepared to leave, but hesitated at the door. "There's something I haven't told you. Something Richard shared with me years ago." I braced myself for yet another revelation. He tried to leave Vivian after the boys were grown, had divorce papers drawn up 3 separate times. Each time, she threatened to reveal financial irregularities from the company's early days, matters that would have triggered investigations and potentially destroyed everything he'd built. "The leverage she held over him," I murmured. "Yes, but what Richard never told her was that he'd already quietly addressed those old issues, paid back taxes with interest, made anonymous restitutions. The threat she held was effectively empty for the last decade, But he never corrected her misconception. Why wouldn't he tell her? Free himself? Harold's expression was complicated. Because once that leverage was gone, he feared what she might do instead. The devil you know, as they say. As his car disappeared down the gravel drive, I returned to the dining room and our strategy notes. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something beyond grief and betrayal, a sense of clarity and purpose. In the bedroom mirror, I studied my reflection. The woman looking back seemed different, her posture straighter, her gaze sharper. I remembered Richard once saying that true character reveals itself not in comfort, but in crisis. Tomorrow I would return to Boston, not as the shattered, retreating woman who had fled, but as someone prepared to fight for truth, messy, complicated, and painful as it might be. The Boston Globe offices occupied the same building they had since I was a young teacher bringing my students on field trips. I smoothed my newly tailored navy suit and touched the simple pearl earrings, a deliberately understated choice for my first public appearance in months. Ms. Wright, Jennifer Mackenzie, the Globe's veteran investigative reporter, rose to greet me. "Thank you for reaching out. Thank you for agreeing to hear my side," I replied, taking the offered seat in the small conference room. Jennifer activated her recorder. "You've been at the center of quite a storm. The Montgomery family has been quite vocal about their version of events." "Yes," I said simply. "I thought it was time for the truth to be heard." "Your truth," she clarified. "The truth," I corrected gently, supported by documentation and facts. For the next hour, I told my story, meeting Richard in my literature seminar, our gradual friendship that blossomed into romance, and the shocking revelations after his death. I spoke without bitterness or accusation, presenting the narrative with the same clarity I once used to explain complex literary themes to students. Richard was a complicated man living a divided life, I concluded. I won't pretend I wasn't devastated to learn about Vivian and his family, but I won't allow that pain to erase what was genuine between us. Jennifer studied me. "The family suggests your relationship was different than you've described, that you were more caretaker than companion." I smiled faintly. Richard was 78, not 98. He was physically and mentally vibrant until his heart attack. We hiked, traveled, attended concerts. Our relationship was balanced and mutual, exactly what you'd expect between educated adults who enjoy each other's company. And the will? 70% of his fortune is significant. It was as surprising to me as to everyone else. I never discussed inheritance with Richard. My pension from 40 years of teaching serves my needs quite adequately. Yet you're fighting for it. I met her gaze directly. I'm fighting for the truth. And for the 500 employees of Montgomery Development whose livelihoods could be affected by this dispute. How so? I chose my words carefully. Richard built his company on principles of integrity and fair dealing. Whoever controls it going forward should honor that legacy. The resulting article, published 3 days later, presented a starkly different narrative than the one the Montgomery family had been cultivating. I was portrayed not as a predatory gold digger, but as a dignified educator, blindsided by revelations about her partner's double life, expressing concern for the company's employees rather than personal gain. Online comments reflected shifting public sentiment. "She seems more concerned about the workers than the money," and "Why is no one asking why Montgomery lied to her for 5 years?" The following week brought the first court hearing in the will contest. I entered the courthouse flanked by Harold and 2 additional attorneys he'd engaged, Elizabeth Chen, a renowned trust expert, and Michael Devereaux, who specialized in testamentary capacity cases. Vivian, Gregory, and Robert sat with their legal team across the courtroom, their expressions hardening when I entered. Only Megan, seated slightly apart, showed any reaction other than contempt, a flicker of curiosity as she studied my composed demeanor. The hearing itself was procedural, establishing timelines for discovery and depositions, but our team's preparation and calm professionalism clearly unsettled the opposition, who had expected a frightened, isolated woman they could easily intimidate. As we exited the courthouse, Megan Montgomery detached herself from her family and approached me. At 17, she had Vivian's striking features softened by a vulnerability her grandmother had long since buried. "Ms. Wright?" Her voice was quiet but steady. I wanted to say something." I paused, aware of Vivian watching from across the plaza. "My grandfather mentioned you. Not by name," she added quickly, But he talked about a friend who shared his love of books. He seemed different when he came back from Chicago, happier. The simple observation pierced through my carefully maintained composure. "Thank you for telling me that, Megan." She glanced back at her waiting family. "They don't talk about him as a person, just as assets and reputation." I offered my card. "If you ever want to talk about the person he was, I'm here." She took it, tucking it quickly into her pocket before rejoining her family. As their cars pulled away, Harold gave me an appraising look. That was unexpected, the granddaughter reaching out. "Sometimes the youngest see most clearly," I replied, watching the Montgomery's sleek town car disappear into traffic. "Ready for what comes next?" Harold asked. I nodded, straightening my shoulders. "Absolutely. It's time to move from defense to action." The preliminary audit findings are concerning, to say the least. The silver-haired woman speaking was Catherine Reeves, managing partner at Reeves and Morton Forensic Accounting, the firm our legal team had engaged to examine Montgomery Development's financial records as part of the inheritance dispute. I sat with Harold in his office as Catherine presented her report, 6 weeks into what had become an increasingly complex legal battle. "We've identified numerous irregularities in the reporting structures," she continued, displaying a chart on her tablet, "particularly in divisions overseen directly by Gregory Montgomery. Projects consistently over budget with funds redirected through a series of shell companies." Harold nodded grimly. "Consistent with the records Eleanor discovered. This particular pattern caught our attention." Catherine highlighted a transaction series. "Identical irregularities appear in projects managed by Robert Montgomery, suggesting coordination." "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "Based on preliminary findings?" "Approximately $38 million over 7 years. The number hung in the air, so much larger than even Richard had suspected. "There's more," Catherine continued. "We found evidence suggesting financial statements presented to Richard Montgomery were systematically altered before reaching him." A knock interrupted us as Harold's assistant entered. "I'm sorry, but there's someone here insisting on speaking with Ms. Wright. A Mr. James Farrell?" The name meant nothing to me, but Harold's expression changed. "Former VP of Operations at Montgomery Development. Gregory forced him out 3 years ago." I nodded my approval, and moments later a man in his 60s entered, nervously clutching a leather portfolio. "Ms. Wright?" he began without preamble. "I've been following the dispute in the news. There are things you should know about how the company has been operated." Over the next hour, James Farrell detailed a disturbing pattern. Projects manipulated to generate excessive costs, vendors pressured to produce dual invoices, and regulatory corners cut to maximize profits. Most damning was his account of trying to alert Richard to these issues. "I compiled a report for Mr. Montgomery," Farrell explained, opening his portfolio to reveal documents. "Detailed everything I'd found, but he never received it." "How can you be sure?" Harold asked. "Because Gregory intercepted it, called me into his office the next day, said my disloyalty was unacceptable. I was terminated with a severance package contingent on a strict non-disclosure agreement." Farrell's hands trembled slightly. "But with Mr. Montgomery gone and the company's future uncertain, I believe I'm morally obligated to speak up." This unexpected ally provided the final pieces we needed. Through careful legal maneuvering, we ensured his evidence became part of the court record, triggering scrutiny beyond what the Montgomery family had anticipated. The effects rippled quickly. At an emergency board meeting the following week, Gregory faced uncomfortable questions about discrepancies in the Westlake development project. Witnesses reported him becoming defensive, even hostile, accusing board members of disloyalty and sabotage. Robert, meanwhile, began distancing himself from financial decisions, claiming his role had focused on client relationships while Gregory managed the numbers. This transparent attempt to avoid responsibility created the first visible fracture between the brothers. I monitored these developments from a distance, never directly engaging, but ensuring our legal team strategically introduced evidence that widened these cracks. The Montgomery family had expected to fight a simple will contest against a single opponent. Instead, they found themselves battling internal divisions and external investigations. 2 days after the board meeting, a private investigator we'd hired reported observing a heated argument between Vivian and Gregory in the parking garage of the Montgomery building. Though we couldn't hear the exchange, the body language told the story. Vivian gesturing angrily, Gregory responding defensively, then both turning on Robert when he attempted to intervene. That evening, My phone rang with an unknown number. I answered cautiously. Ms. Wright? It's Megan Montgomery. Megan, is everything all right? A pause. Not really. I've been listening to them. My father, uncle, and grandmother. The things they're saying. Planning. Her voice wavered. I found some emails on my grandmother's computer. About you. About the campaign they created to discredit you. That doesn't surprise me, I said gently. It should surprise me, she replied, a new hardness in her young voice. But it doesn't. That's what bothers me most. I've watched them do this to others before. I just never questioned it until now. Why are you telling me this? Because my grandfather deserved better. And maybe you do too. She hesitated. I have access to their emails. Would that help? I closed my eyes, considering the ethical implications. Megan, I don't want to put you in a difficult position. I'm already in one, she interrupted. Every day I watch them lie and scheme while pretending it's about protecting my grandfather's legacy. But they never cared about his legacy before he died. After a long pause, I asked, why do you think that is? Because they never really knew him, she answered simply. But I think you did. As we ended the call, I realized the landscape of this battle had shifted yet again. The Montgomery family's greatest vulnerability wasn't financial or legal. It was the brittle facade of unity that had already begun to crack under pressure. He wants to talk, Harold said, closing his office door behind him. Gregory contacted me privately this morning. 6 months had passed since Richard's funeral. What began as a simple will contest had evolved into something far more complex as our strategic pressure exposed deeper issues within the Montgomery empire. Talk or negotiate? I asked. Both. He's scared, Eleanor. The Securities and Exchange Commission has opened a preliminary investigation based on the irregularities our accountants identified. I absorbed this information, remembering the arrogant man who had sneered at me during the will reading. What exactly does he want? Protection. He's offering information in exchange for our help in securing immunity. 2 hours later, I sat in an adjoining room watching through one-way glass as Gregory Montgomery spoke with Harold and our legal team. The transformation was striking. Gone was the confident heir, replaced by a nervous man who couldn't stop fidgeting with his wedding ring. It wasn't my idea, he insisted, pushing documents across the table. The offshore accounts, the diverted funds, that was Robert and my mother. I just went along with it. Yet you signed these authorizations, Harold noted, indicating several papers. Gregory's face flushed. You don't understand what it's like. In our family, you either participate or you're excluded. My father built this impossible legacy, and my mother made it clear that maintaining it, by any means necessary, was our only option. And Richard never knew? He suspected something in recent years. Started asking more questions, demanding more detailed reports. Gregory ran a hand through his thinning hair. That's when Robert suggested we keep him distracted with symbolic projects while we handled the real business. By real business, you mean fraud? Harold's tone remained neutral. Gregory flinched. It wasn't supposed to go this far, just some creative accounting to maximize profits during the recession. Then it became the standard procedure. For the next hour, he detailed a disturbing pattern of financial manipulation, implicating Robert as the primary architect and Vivian as the enforcer who ensured Richard remained unaware. Most disturbing was his description of the campaign against me, a calculated effort orchestrated by Vivian, who had hired private investigators to construct a narrative of me as an opportunistic caregiver. They had paid for planted stories, pressured mutual acquaintances to distance themselves from me, and even fabricated concerns about Richard's mental capacity. My mother said, "We needed to destroy your credibility before you could gain public sympathy," Gregory admitted. "Make you toxic so no one would listen when you fought back." Watching this confession, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. The family Richard had protected, even at the cost of his own happiness, had never deserved his loyalty. When the formal interview concluded, I entered the room. Gregory's eyes widened in surprise. "Ms. Wright, I didn't realize you were here." "Clearly," I replied, taking a seat across from him. "I wanted to hear directly why you felt entitled to destroy my reputation." He couldn't hold my gaze. It wasn't personal. It felt extremely personal when friends stopped speaking to me, when I was disinvited from the school where I taught for 40 years, when newspapers called me a predator. Gregory stared at his hands. "I'm sorry. Your apology means nothing without action," I said calmly. Here's what happens next. You will provide sworn testimony correcting the record about your father's mental capacity and his relationship with me. You will acknowledge publicly that the narrative your family created was fabricated. My mother will never agree. I'm not talking to your mother, I interrupted. I'm talking to you. A man who claims to want protection must first demonstrate he deserves it. Later that evening, as Harold drove me home, my phone chimed with an email from an anonymous account. The message contained audio files and a brief note. Recorded last night. Thought you should hear. I played the first file, immediately recognizing Vivian's cultured voice. We need to accelerate the plan. The audit is getting too close to the Cayman transfers. Robert's voice responded. What about Gregory? He's becoming a liability. Your brother has always been weak, Vivian replied dismissively. If necessary, we make him the scapegoat. Focus on discrediting the old woman first. Once her reputation is completely destroyed, no judge will rule in her favor. I closed my eyes, letting the full weight of their calculated cruelty wash over me. When I opened them again, my resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. Harold, I said quietly, I think it's time for phase 2. Are you certain? Once we move forward with this approach, there's no going back. I thought of Richard's journals, of his trapped existence between obligation and truth, of the decades he lost to Vivian's manipulation. I'm certain, I replied. No more hiding, no more fear. It's time for the complete truth to come out. The press conference room at the Fairmont Hotel buzzed with anticipation. Financial reporters, local news crews, and society columnists filled the seats, drawn by the cryptic invitation promising significant developments in the Montgomery estate dispute. I sat in the adjoining preparation room, watching the monitor as Gregory Montgomery approached the podium, flanked by his attorney and our legal team. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. Good morning, he began, voice unsteady. I've called this press conference to correct certain misrepresentations regarding my late father, Richard Montgomery, and his relationship with Eleanor Wright. The room quieted as reporters sensed this wasn't the usual corporate statement. Contrary to previous claims made by myself and other family members, my father was of completely sound mind until his death. The suggestion that he suffered cognitive decline or was unduly influenced is false, a narrative we created to contest his will. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Furthermore, I must clarify that Ms. Wright was never my father's caregiver, but his companion in a relationship that brought him genuine happiness in his final years. The characterization of her as an opportunist was, he paused, swallowing hard, deliberately fabricated to discredit her. Gregory continued, acknowledging his participation in financial irregularities within Montgomery Development and announcing his cooperation with ongoing investigations. He concluded by publicly apologizing to me for a calculated campaign to destroy the reputation of a woman whose only crime was bringing joy to my father's life. As he stepped away from the podium, the room erupted with questions. Our lead attorney stepped forward to field them, while Gregory was escorted out a side door. Watching on the monitor, I felt no triumph, only a weary relief that the truth was finally emerging. The aftermath was swift and dramatic. Montgomery Development stock plummeted as investors reacted to revelations of financial misconduct. Robert, blindsided by his brother's confession, held a competing press conference the following day, vehemently denying knowledge of any wrongdoing and threatening to sue Gregory for defamation. My brother has clearly suffered a breakdown, he told reporters. His allegations are the desperate attempts of a guilty man to divert attention from his own actions. This fraternal civil war played out across Boston media, with former employees and business associates coming forward with their own accounts of the company's toxic culture. The carefully constructed Montgomery family image crumbled as decades of suppressed resentments and questionable practices came to light. Vivian maintained public silence until the third day, when the pressure became too great. During a hastily arranged interview with a sympathetic local news anchor, she attempted to portray herself as a devoted wife, blindsided by her husband's betrayal and her son's deception. Richard's relationship with this woman was clearly a midlife crisis that extended into his senior years, she claimed, her usual composure showing cracks. As for Gregory's ridiculous allegations, I can only assume he's being manipulated by outside forces. The interview backfired spectacularly when the anchor, sensing a ratings opportunity, pressed harder than expected about financial discrepancies and Vivian's role in managing family affairs. Her facade cracked completely when asked directly about evidence suggesting she had orchestrated the campaign against me. "That woman destroyed my family," she snapped, abandoning her script. 45 years I gave to Richard, to building the Montgomery name, and he leaves our legacy to his mistress?" The raw bitterness in her voice revealed more than any carefully crafted statement could have. By evening, clips of her outburst circulated widely, accompanied by side-by-side comparisons with my Measured Globe interview. 3 days later, as the crisis reached its peak, I received an urgent call from Megan. "Grandmother's in the hospital," she said, her voice tight with stress. "She collapsed during a meeting with the family lawyers. They're saying it was a stroke." "I'm so sorry, Megan," I said sincerely. "Is there anything I can do?" A pause. "Actually, yes. She's asking to see you." The hospital room was eerily quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors. Vivian Montgomery looked diminished against the white sheets, her right side weakened by the stroke, but her eyes remained sharp as I entered. Megan squeezed my hand before leaving us alone, closing the door softly behind her. "You won," Vivian said finally, her speech slightly slurred. "Congratulations. This was never about winning," I replied, taking a seat beside the bed. "Wasn't it?" Her laugh was bitter. "You get his money, his company, his legacy. I get the truth, Vivian. That's all I ever wanted." She studied me with narrowed eyes. "How did you do it? What evidence did Richard leave you?" "Enough," I said simply, though I didn't use the most damaging parts. "Why not? You could have destroyed us completely." I considered my answer carefully. "Because Richard spent his life protecting the company and its employees. Exposing everything would have hurt innocent people." Vivian's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something, not quite respect, but perhaps recognition, crossing her face. "He kept a photograph of you and the boys," I said, placing a small envelope on her bedside table. "From a sailing trip, I believe. It was among his private papers." Her hand moved toward it, then stopped. "Why give this to me?" "Because despite everything, it mattered to him. He kept it all these years." As I rose to leave, Vivian spoke again, her voice softer. "He was never going to choose, you know. Between his worlds, he didn't have the courage." "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "or perhaps he simply valued different things than you thought he should." In the hallway, Megan waited anxiously. "What did she say to you?" "Nothing I didn't already know," I replied, suddenly exhausted by the weight of it all. "The past cannot be changed, Megan. We can only decide what to do with the future." She nodded slowly, wisdom beyond her years in her eyes. That's what Grandpa used to say. The courthouse steps gleamed in the autumn sunlight as I emerged, Harold and our legal team flanking me protectively. After 10 months of legal battles, expert testimonies, and financial investigations, Judge Harriet Coleman had delivered her ruling. Richard Montgomery's will would stand as written, with no modifications. Reporters clustered at the bottom of the steps, shouting questions as we descended. "Ms. Wright, how does it feel to be vindicated? What are your plans for Montgomery development? Will you pursue criminal charges against the family?" Harold stepped forward. "My client is grateful for Judge Coleman's thorough consideration of the evidence. This ruling confirms what we've maintained throughout. Richard Montgomery was of sound mind and made his wishes clear. Ms. Wright intends to honor those wishes with the respect they deserve." I nodded in agreement, maintaining the dignified silence I'd cultivated throughout the proceedings. The media had labeled it elegant restraint, but in truth, I simply found no satisfaction in public statements. The victory felt hollow against the backdrop of the past year's revelations. Back in Harold's office, we reviewed the practical implications of the decision. Montgomery Development remained under court-appointed management while various financial investigations continued, but I now had clear authority to determine its future direction. "The SEC has reached a preliminary agreement with Gregory," Harold explained. "His cooperation has earned him considerable leniency, probation, financial penalties, and community service rather than incarceration. And Robert? Less fortunate. His attempts to blame everything on Gregory backfired when evidence proved he was actually the primary architect of the financial schemes. He's negotiating a plea deal, but some jail time seems inevitable." I nodded, feeling no vindication at Robert's downfall. "What about the employees?" "Nervous but stable for now. The court-appointed management team has done a good job maintaining operations despite the turmoil. The weeks following the ruling brought a flurry of decisions and transitions. I established residence in one of Richard's properties, not the mansion he had shared with Vivian, but a smaller waterfront home where we had spent weekends together. From there, I began the process of fulfilling what I now understood to be my responsibility to Richard's legacy. I assembled a transition team of respected industry veterans to stabilize Montgomery development, implementing governance reforms to prevent future misconduct. Though I maintained legal control, I deliberately distanced myself from day-to-day operations, focusing instead on establishing ethical guidelines and employee protections. Throughout this period, my relationship with Megan deepened into something neither of us had anticipated. Her weekly visits became a bright spot in the otherwise exhausting process of untangling Richard's complex affairs. "Dad's accepting the plea deal," she told me one afternoon as we walked along the harbor. 3 years with eligibility for early release after 18 months. "How do you feel about that?" I asked. She shrugged, kicking at a pebble. "Relieved, honestly. The waiting and fighting was worse. At least now there's clarity." "And your grandmother?" "Physically recovering, but bitter. She blames everyone but herself." Megan glanced at me sideways. "She still won't acknowledge that Grandpa had any legitimate reasons to be unhappy in their marriage. People construct narratives they can live with," I said gently. "It's human nature." "Is that what you did? When you found out about the double life?" The question caught me off guard with its perceptiveness. I suppose I did at first. I told myself our relationship must have been meaningless to him. "But you don't believe that anymore?" "No. Relationships aren't that simple." "Megan, Richard made choices I wish he hadn't, but that doesn't erase what was genuine between us." She nodded thoughtfully. "You know, you're nothing like they said you were. For years, whenever Grandpa went to Chicago, Grandmother would make these little comments about his distractions there. She made it sound so sordid. And now? Now I understand he was just trying to find some peace." She looked out over the water. "Do you think you'll stay in Boston?" "For now," I replied. "There's still much to resolve." Later that evening, as I reviewed proposals for a corporate restructuring, my phone rang with Vivian's number, the first direct contact since our hospital room conversation months earlier. "Eleanor," she said without preamble, her speech still slightly affected from the stroke, "I'd like to meet." We arranged to meet at a neutral location, a private room at the Boston Arts Club where neither of us had previous connections. Vivian arrived using a cane, her posture still regal despite her physical challenges. "Thank you for coming," she said, lowering herself carefully into a chair. "What can I do for you, Vivian?" She studied me with those penetrating eyes that had once intimidated Boston's elite. "I'm not here to apologize. I didn't expect you were." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Good. We understand each other." She placed a folder on the table between us. "I'm here about the house." "The mansion?" "It's yours for life, as Richard stipulated. It's too large for me now. The stairs are difficult, and the memories—" She trailed off. "I've found a suitable apartment. I want to sell the house." "You don't need my permission for that." "Legally, I do. The property reverts to you upon my death or voluntary vacation." I leaned back, considering her. "Why tell me this in person? Your lawyers could have handled it." Vivian's expression remained carefully controlled. "Because I wanted to see for myself what kind of woman you've become through all this, whether Richard's faith in you was justified." "And your conclusion?" She closed the folder, her hand lingering on it. "You've handled things differently than I would have, not necessarily worse." Coming from Vivian Montgomery, this qualified as extravagant praise. "The house is yours to sell," I said. "I'll have Harold prepare the necessary paperwork." As she rose to leave, Vivian paused. "He kept a journal, you know, for 40 years. I found them after our 10th anniversary. Detailed accounts of his disappointments, his regrets. Why are you telling me this?" "Because I read them all. Every word. I knew exactly who my husband was and what he thought of our marriage." Her voice remained steady. "I chose to stay anyway, to build something lasting, even if it wasn't what romantic fools consider love." With that parting revelation, she left me sitting alone, contemplating the different ways people justify their choices, and wondering what justifications I might someday make for my own. 18 months after Richard's death, I stood at the podium in the Montgomery Building's main conference room, facing an audience that represented all facets of the complicated legacy I had inherited: corporate executives, board members, family representatives, and community leaders. "Thank you all for coming today," I began. my voice steady. We've gathered to announce several decisions regarding the future of Richard Montgomery's personal and corporate legacy. My gaze moved across familiar faces. Harold, looking satisfied. Megan, supportly attentive. Vivian, maintaining her dignity despite everything. Gregory, humbled by his legal troubles. And Robert, recently released for this event from his minimum security confinement. First, I'm pleased to announce the establishment of the Richard Montgomery Foundation, dedicated to causes that matter deeply to Richard: educational opportunities for seniors and legal aid for victims of financial exploitation. A ripple of approving murmurs swept the room. The foundation will receive 50% of Richard's personal estate, distributed over the next decade to ensure sustainable impact rather than fleeting generosity. I detailed the corporate restructuring that would protect jobs while implementing transparent governance. The professional management team I'd assembled had already stabilized operations, and today's announcement formalized their continued role. Finally, I continued, I want to address some personal provisions. I announced the educational trust for Megan, ensuring her independence as she pursued her studies, the dignified settlement for Vivian that acknowledged her long connection to the Montgomery name, and the controlled opportunities for Gregory and Robert to rebuild their lives through supervised roles in smaller company divisions. These decisions reflect not just Richard's intentions, but the values he aspired to uphold throughout his life. They balance accountability with opportunity, consequence with compassion. As the formal meeting concluded and people broke into conversation groups, I stepped away, seeking a moment of quiet by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. The city stretched below, autumn sunlight glinting off the water. Quite a view, Megan said, joining me. Grandpa said he chose this building because it let him see the whole city he helped build. I smiled. That sounds like him. She studied me carefully. Are you happy with how everything turned out? The question gave me pause. Happy isn't the right word. At peace, perhaps, even after everything they did to you. Pursuing vengeance would have changed me into someone I wouldn't recognize, I replied. And seeking approval, from Richard's memory or anyone else, would have been another kind of prison. So what do you feel? Liberation, I said simply. The freedom to write my own story going forward. As the gathering dispersed, I found myself alone in Richard's former office. I'd avoided this space until now, unwilling to confront the physical reminder of his compartmentalized life. The room had been cleared of personal items, but something of his presence remained in the carefully chosen artwork and the worn leather chair behind the imposing desk. I crossed to the window, where he must have stood countless times, looking out at the city. The ring he'd given me, now worn on my right hand instead of my left, caught the light as I raised my hand to the glass. Goodbye, Richard, I whispered. That evening, I hosted a small dinner at my home, the waterfront property I'd decided to keep while donating the others. Harold and his wife attended, along with Margaret and 2 other friends who had stood by me throughout the ordeal. Megan came too, having gradually become a surrogate granddaughter of sorts. As conversation flowed around my dining table, I found myself observing rather than participating, struck by how much had changed. The woman who had once defined herself as a professor, then as Richard's partner, and briefly as his betrayed mistress, had become something else entirely, someone defined by her own choices and principles. Later, as the gathering wound down, Megan helped me clear dishes in the kitchen. I've decided on my major, she announced. Business ethics and corporate governance. I raised an eyebrow. Influenced by recent events, I imagine? Someone needs to prevent the next generation of Montgomerys from following the old patterns, she said with unexpected conviction. An admirable goal. She hesitated, then asked, would you consider being on the advisory board for the new ethics center at my university? They're looking for people with real-world experience. I'm hardly a business expert, Megan. No, but you've navigated one of the most complex corporate ethics cases in Boston history without losing yourself in the process. She smiled. That's exactly the perspective students need to hear. After my guests departed, I walked alone along the shoreline path behind the house. The night was clear, stars reflecting on the gentle waves. In the distance, the lights of Boston created a glittering panorama, the city where I'd spent my entire life, yet somehow felt like I was seeing with new eyes. At 73, I found myself contemplating beginnings rather than endings. The foundation work would occupy much of my time, but I'd also accepted an invitation to teach a seminar on ethics in literature at my former school, a symbolic reclaiming of the professional identity that had been temporarily obscured. The ring on my right hand caught moonlight as I reached the end of the path. I twisted it thoughtfully, remembering Richard's face when he'd given it to me. Hopeful, tender, complicated. For a moment I considered removing it, making the symbolic break complete. Instead, I left it where it was, not as a reminder of being the other woman, but as a marker of a journey that had ultimately led me back to myself. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.